Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for April 3rd, 2025. I think it's about time that people start being held accountable for the lies and corruption that are directing the policies of the United States. As American citizens, we have the responsibility to make sure that the government that we elect acts on behalf of the interests of its citizens. And what is clear, and has been clear for a long time, is that whether it's the Congress, whether it's the executive branch, whether it's even the judiciary, that there are private interests that are shaping the policies that go against the interests of the citizens. And that's something that we have to correct. Now, today I'm going to talk about what's come out now to show that the Biden administration was lying about the Ukraine war from the beginning, and that the lies brought us very close to the possibility of a nuclear war with Russia. When I talk about the Biden administration, I'm not talking about feeble Joe. I'm talking about the collective Biden, the operatives such as Blinken and Sullivan and Susan Rice, who run the policy, but they're running it on behalf of the string pullers of the corporate cartels of the military-industrial financial complex. So when I talk about Biden, I'm not talking about the guy who looks like he can barely walk straight. I'm talking about the people who make the policy, what some people call the deep state. Now, since the February 2014 regime change coup in Ukraine, the LaRouche organization has been truthfully reporting the policy that brought us to the verge of nuclear war with Russia. How the U.S. neocons launched a proxy war using Ukraine to try to break apart Russia. This was Obama administration. It was followed up in the Biden administration. Some of this was on automatic pilot when Trump was president. But the idea was to break up Russia, to grab the raw materials, to weaken Russia as an independent sovereign state. And this was a strategy that goes back to 1992 and the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Empire. But the important thing is it brought us close to nuclear war. And it was based on lie after lie. And the most important lie was that the special military operation that Putin launched in February 2022 was, quote, unprovoked. Now, the fact of the matter is that there's vast evidence to show that it was precisely provoked. And I'm not going to go through all of that because I've done this repeatedly on this platform. But what we've seen is that there have been hundreds of billions of dollars spent on this war. There have been hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians killed and close to 100,000 Russians killed in this war. And now that there are long-range missiles that are targeting Russia, that's what puts us on the verge of nuclear war. Now, if you say that, you'll be accused of conspiracy theories. But the actual conspiracy is to cover up the truth. That if you tell the truth, you're called a Putin mouthpiece or an information terrorist, spreading disinformation. For telling the truth, I was put on a hit list of the Ukrainian government, which is actually run by NATO. A hit list which includes Helga Zepp-LaRouche of the Schiller Institute, Diane Sayre, and people such as Scott Ritter and Jeffrey Sachs and Jimmy Dore. We've all been put on this hit list, which is run by NATO to silence those who tell the truth. Now, the biggest problem to address is, where's the accountability? Where are the charges against Biden, Blinken, and others? Now remember, Donald Trump won the election in 2024 as a candidate for peace, for ending this war. He said he could end it in 24 hours. He's finding out it's more complicated than that, partly because of what's been put in place by the West to protect the Zelensky government. And the Europeans are saying that if Trump wants out, they'll take over the war. So the danger still exists, the danger of provocation of Russia by NATO And as long as the U.S. is a member of NATO, that provocation would include a targeting possibly of the United States. Now, the fact that Europe still wants to fight shows how crazy the European governments are. But I want to call your attention to something which came out last Sunday, a lengthy article in the New York Times titled "The Partnership: The Secret History of the War in Ukraine." This is a 13,000-word article, so it's a long article. It was based on a year-long investigation and interviews with over 300 people. And what the article points out is that the deployment was not just of U.S. weapons and money paying for the operations of the Ukraine government, but U.S. troops, technical experts, deployed up to the borders of Russia inside Ukraine. And there are many, many details in the article, which include the fact that there was a headquarters for this war set up in Wiesbaden, Germany, which coincidentally is where the LaRouche organization has its headquarters in Europe, in Wiesbaden. But this is a longtime American center, and it was out of there that the coordination between Ukraine and the United States was done. Now, the article, as I said, has many, many details, including the lies around Minsk, the Minsk Accord, including the evidence that Putin was right, that there was a planned Ukrainian offensive into the Donbass against the Russian-speaking population of Donbass. So the article itself gives you an accurate picture as far as it goes. The question about it is, why did it take so long? Why did the New York Times peddle the lies for all those years and then finally decide last week to come out and tell the truth? But the important point is that you can see clearly that the American people were being lied to by Joe Biden, who was reading a script prepared for him by the military-industrial financial complex, the corporate cartels that run U.S. policy and that run the war policy. And this is the same pattern we've seen repeatedly since the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963 and the cover-up, which is still continuing to this day, although the dribs and drabs of the release of documents are showing more interesting aspects. The story is still not being exposed fully. But since that assassination, and I would argue that the main reason he was killed was that he was not going along with the empire's policy of continuing the Cold War against the Soviet Union. But that over that whole period of time, the U.S. has been brought into war after war based on false flags, lies, deception, and censorship. Now that Trump is going to work with Putin, and they've already established the basis for normalization, that's good as far as it goes. We have to end this war as quickly as possible. And we should tell the Europeans they should forget about continuing the war because they can't afford it. And the United States is not going to back them up. But what are the lessons that we should have learned? That negotiation and diplomacy is how to diffuse these kinds of crises. Secondly, you cannot allow a deep state operation of entrenched bureaucrats who work on behalf of the private interests of the corporate cartels. You cannot allow them to make policy. And that's why it's so important that the investigation identify who are the sources of the lies, where they come from, and what their intention is. And then these lying neocons have to be cleaned out. There should be none of these people left in the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, and so on. And by saying none of them should be left in there, they should all be immediately fired, and many of them brought up on charges of war crimes. So the question now is, will there be accountability for the Biden team, the collective Biden? Secondly, will Donald Trump allow the remnants of these networks convince him to go to war against Iran on behalf of Israel? And will these same networks convince him he has to go to war against China, as was indicated in a Department of Defense memo released by Secretary Helga just the other day? So these networks have to be cleaned out and their policies ended, not just to restore the reputation of the United States, but to ensure that we can have a new era with a new security architecture that takes into consideration the legitimate concerns of all nations, and that combine that with an economic development perspective, which provides the incentives for peaceful cooperation. Now, I would urge people to listen to the webcast dialogue I had with Helga Zepp-LaRouche yesterday, which is linked in the description section below. It was titled, "Stop Rearmament, Defuse the Debt Bomb." And Helga goes through some of these salient points, as well as what's happening in France, what's happening in Germany, what's happening with India and China, a whole series of topics that you people sent to us for your questions. So take the time to look at that, but become active. We as Americans cannot sit by while we have government officials lying for the sake of private corporate interests that are draining our treasury and killing our young people. And the people who do that, who are responsible for it, must be brought to account. Now, tomorrow's Friday. I'll be taking your questions. You can send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com, and I hope to hear from a lot of you.